sometimes the hardest choices aren't about right and wrong, they're about whether we still have the courage to be decent. Reed Mallory, a 61-year-old cowboy weathered by loss, thought his days of standing for something were behind him. Then, on a bitter winter afternoon, he opened his barn door and found two women hiding in the hay, an elderly native woman and her grown daughter, refugees from a land grab that stripped them of everything. The world would tell Reed to look away, to protect himself, let someone else carry the burden. But something in their frightened eyes reminded him of the man he used to be. What would you do if compassion meant risking everything you had left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana winter arrived that year the way it always did, without apology and without mercy. Reed Mallory stood at his kitchen window, watching the first snow of December settle across his ranch like a cold blessing. The flakes came down thick and steady, blanketing the fence posts and the sagging roof of the barn, turning the world into something clean and quiet. It was the kind of morning that used to make Sarah smile, back when morning still held that sort of promise. 3 years had passed since they'd buried her. 3 years of coffee drunk alone, of meals eaten in silence, of nights that stretched longer than they had any right to. Reed had turned 61 that October, though he'd barely noticed the day come and go. Time moved differently now. It didn't heal so much as accumulate, piling up like the snow outside, covering everything but changing nothing underneath. He poured his second cup of coffee and carried it to the worn leather chair by the fireplace. The chair still held the shape of his body from decades of use, a comfortable groove he settled into each morning after the livestock were fed. The routine was everything now. Wake at 5, dress in the dark, check the horses, the few head of cattle he kept, return to the house, coffee, chair, stare at nothing until the sun climbed high enough to demand something more from the day. The silver locket sat on the mantel where he'd placed it the morning after the funeral. He hadn't touched it since. Sarah's face looked out from behind the tarnished metal, frozen in a moment from 30 years ago when her hair was darker and her smile came easier. Some days he could walk past it without looking. Other days, like this one, it pulled at him with a weight that made his chest tight. They'd met at a church social in Billings. She'd been wearing a blue dress and had laughed at something her friend said, and Reed had known in that instant that his life was about to change. He'd been 28 then, already set in his ways, already comfortable with solitude. But Sarah had a way of making solitude seem like loneliness, and loneliness like something worth fixing. They'd married 6 months later in a small ceremony with more flowers than guests, and she'd moved into this house with nothing but 2 suitcases and a belief that love could root itself anywhere. For 33 years, she'd been right. Their son Marcus had been born the following spring, a colicky baby who grew into a serious boy and then a serious man. He lived in Denver now, worked in something called financial consulting, wore suits that cost more than Reed spent on feed in a month. They talked once a month, maybe twice if Marcus remembered to call on a Sunday. The conversations were brief and careful, like 2 men stepping around a hole neither wanted to acknowledge. Marcus had wanted Reed to sell the ranch after Sarah died. "Come to Denver, Dad. You don't need to be out there alone." But Reed couldn't imagine it, couldn't picture himself in some apartment building with walls shared and neighbors who nodded politely in hallways. This land held Sarah in ways that Denver never could. Her garden, now overgrown, the porch where they'd watched summer storms, the bedroom where she'd died, slowly and then all at once, holding his hand until the morphine pulled her somewhere he couldn't follow. So he'd stayed. And Marcus had stopped asking. Tom Hendricks stopped by most Wednesdays, the only intrusion Reed allowed into his carefully constructed solitude. Tom was 65, weathered as old leather, and had ranched the property to the east for 40 years. He'd known Sarah, had stood beside Reed at the funeral, had understood without being told that some griefs don't ease with time or company. "You're letting the place go," Tom had said last week, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Reed had nodded. It was true. The barn needed repairs he kept postponing. Fence lines sagged. The vegetable garden Sarah had tended was now just frozen earth and the ghosts of tomato stakes. But the work felt pointless without her there to see it finished, to admire the results, to make it mean something beyond mere maintenance. Railroads pushing hard. Tom had continued. They've been buying up land south of here, offering good money from what I hear. Reed had only grunted. The railroad had been creeping north for 2 years now, swallowing homesteads and small ranches, leaving check stubs and empty foundations in its wake. The railroad men came through in their pressed suits, talking about progress and economic development, about how the old ways couldn't sustain themselves anymore. They spoke as if the land were nothing but numbers on a ledger, as if the families who'd worked it for generations were merely obstacles to something grander and more important. Some folks had taken the money. The Hendersons sold out last spring. The Yamamoto family, who'd farmed since before the war, packed up in August. Each departure left the community a little smaller, a little more fragile. The church social didn't have enough women anymore to organize the bake sale. The general store in town had cut its hours. Even Tom admitted he'd been thinking about it, though he hadn't decided yet. Reed hadn't even entertained the thought. This land was Sarah's land, even if she was gone. Selling would be like erasing her completely, and he wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But the railroad wasn't the only pressure changing the landscape. There were other stories, darker ones, that filtered through town. Stories about families being pushed off land that wasn't even being sold, land that had been promised to them generations ago. Reed had heard talk at the feed store about native families being evicted from parcels near the railroad's intended route, land that technically belonged to them through old treaties, but that nobody seemed interested in honoring anymore. The local sheriff did nothing. The county judge looked the other way. It was easier to let it happen than to fight the interests behind it. Reed had listened to those stories the way he listened to most things now, with a kind of distant awareness that didn't require action. It wasn't his problem. He had enough to manage, just keeping himself upright and functional. The snow continued falling. Reed finished his coffee and set the empty cup on the side table. Outside, the world had gone completely white. The mountains in the distance were invisible, erased by the storm. It would be a hard winter, the kind that tested fences and livestock, and the patience of anyone foolish enough to be ranching at his age. He thought about Sarah's grave, up on the hill beneath the cottonwood where they used to picnic in summer. He should go visit, should clear the snow from her headstone, should sit there and talk to her the way he sometimes did when the silence got too heavy. But the cold kept him inside. And maybe that was just an excuse. Maybe he didn't want to admit how little he had to tell her, how the days blurred together, how he'd become exactly the kind of man she'd worried he might become if she ever left him alone. The afternoon stretched on. Reed dozed in the chair, woke, stared at the fire, made himself a sandwich he didn't finish, checked the horses again, though they didn't need checking. The snow had slowed to scattered flurries by the time the sun started its descent. The temperature would drop hard tonight. He'd need to make sure the barn was secure, that the wind couldn't get in through the gaps in the siding. He pulled on his heavy coat and his worn gloves, the ones with the torn thumbs Sarah had always meant to mend but never got around to. The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside, a sharp wind that cut through the fabric and found skin. He tucked his chin and walked the 100 yards to the barn, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The barn door stuck the way it always did, swollen from moisture and age. Reed put his shoulder into it and shoved, and the door scraped open with a groan that echoed in the empty space. The smell hit him first, hay and horse and old wood, familiar and comforting. The 2 horses looked up from their stalls, steam rising from their nostrils. "Just checking on you," Reed said quietly, his voice sounding strange in the stillness. He moved through the familiar space, checking water troughs, feeling the temperature, making sure everything was secure for the night. That's when he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through the cracks, a rustling, something shifting in the hay near the back corner. Reed froze. His first thought was raccoons, or maybe a coyote that had gotten in through a gap he'd missed. He moved toward the sound slowly, his hand reaching for the pitchfork leaning against the wall. But what he found wasn't an animal. Two women were huddled in the hay, pressed against the far wall where the shadows were. Deepest. They were wrapped in threadbare blankets that might have been grey once, but were now just the colour of dirt and hard use. The older woman sat with her back against the wood, her weathered face partially hidden beneath a wool shawl. Her eyes met Reed's without fear, without pleading, just a steady gaze that held him in place. Beside her, a younger woman, maybe 30, maybe 40, it was hard to tell, beneath the grime and exhaustion, clutched a smaller blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were the frightened ones, wide and dark, and filled with something Reed recognized from mirrors he'd been avoiding. Nobody spoke. The moment stretched out, measured in heartbeats, and the soft breathing of the horses. Snow had collected in the women's hair. Their lips were chapped and pale. They'd been here a while. Days, maybe. Long enough to look at him with the careful calculation of people who knew they'd been caught and were waiting to see what came next. Reed stood there, the pitchfork loose in his hand, and felt the weight of a choice settling over him like the snow that continued to fall outside. The world would tell him to send them on. To protect his property, his peace, his carefully constructed solitude, to let this be someone else's problem. But something in their eyes reminded him of the man he used to be. The man Sarah had loved. The man who'd known once how to be decent. Reed lowered the pitchfork slowly, setting it back against the wall. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or something else, he couldn't say. The women hadn't moved. They watched him the way cornered animals watch, with that terrible stillness that comes from knowing movement might mean danger. "How long have you been here?" Reed's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by disuse and surprise. The older woman tilted her head slightly, considering him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, each word carefully chosen. 3 days, maybe 4. We lost track. Reed glanced toward the barn door, half expecting to see someone else, some explanation for why 2 women would be hiding in his barn in the middle of winter. But there was nothing except the snow and the gathering darkness. He looked back at them, taking in details he'd missed in the first shock of discovery. Their clothes were worn but clean, or had been once. The younger woman's hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, her fingers visible through the gaps, red and raw from cold. Neither of them had proper winter gear. No heavy coats, no decent boots. "You're trespassing," Reed said, and immediately felt foolish. Of course they knew that. I could call the sheriff. You could, the older woman agreed. There was no challenge in her tone, just acceptance. She shifted slightly, and Reed caught a glimpse of something tucked against her side, a leather satchel, old and cracked but carefully maintained. The younger woman spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, we'll leave. We just needed somewhere out of the wind." Reed should have said yes, should have told them to be on their way before full dark settled in. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Where are you headed?" The older woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "North. We have family in the Blackfeet territory. Cousins who'll take us in. That's 100 miles from here at least. We know." Reed rubbed his hand across his face, feeling the scrape of 3 days' worth of beard. 100 miles in winter, on foot, with no proper supplies. They'd never make it. They had to know they'd never make it. Why not take a bus? There's a station in town. The younger woman looked down at her hands. The older woman held Reed's gaze. "We can't go into town. There are men looking for us. Railroad men." The words settled between them like stones dropping into still water. Reed felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the barn walls. He'd heard the stories. He'd chosen not to listen too carefully, not to think about what they meant. But here it was, the abstraction made flesh, sitting in his barn and looking at him with eyes that had seen whatever came after the polite men in suits stopped being polite. What happened? Reed asked, though part of him didn't want to know. The older woman reached for the leather satchel beside her and drew out a folded piece of paper. Even from where Reed stood, he could see it was old, the creases worn soft from being opened and refolded countless times. She held it out to him. This is what happened. Reed moved closer, close enough to take the paper from her weathered hand. It was a map, hand-drawn in ink that had faded to brown with age. The lines showed boundaries, parcels of land marked with names and dates. Some of the writing was in English, some was in a language Reed didn't recognize, though he'd seen enough to guess it was native script. At the center of the map was a small valley, maybe 200 acres, bordered by a creek on one side and a rise of hills on the other. "My grandmother drew this," the older woman said. "She was given that land in the Treaty of 1889, put her name on it herself, signed the papers at Fort Benton. 30 families settled there, raised children there, buried their dead there." "Was?" Reed asked quietly. "The railroad wanted the route through the valley. Easier grade, they said. Better access to the timber in the hills." The older woman's voice remained calm, factual, but Reed could hear the grief underneath it, compressed into something hard and heavy. "They came with papers of their own, said the original treaty was invalid, said the land was owned by the territorial government and was being claimed for commercial development. They gave us 30 days to leave. You can fight that," Reed said. "There are lawyers, courts." "We tried." The younger woman spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "We went to the county seat, filed our claim. The judge wouldn't even hear it. Said we'd missed the filing deadline, even though we'd filed twice before and been told to come back later." Reed looked at the map again, at the careful notations, the evidence of lives built and sustained. He thought about the stories he'd heard and dismissed, the conversations he'd walked away from at the feed store. It had been easier to believe the problem was complicated, bureaucratic, not his concern. But here it was, traced in faded ink on paper that had been carried and protected and held onto even as everything else was lost. "When did you leave?" Reed asked. 2 weeks ago, the older woman said. "Most of the families had already gone, took the railroad's money and left, but there were 5 of us who stayed. 5 families who said we wouldn't give up our homes without being forced." The younger woman's voice shook. "They came at dawn. 30 men, maybe. More. They had wagons and tools. They tore down the houses while we were still inside. My husband tried to stop them. He stood in front of our door and told them they had no right." She stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything she could have said. Reed didn't ask what had happened to her husband. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the careful distance she maintained from even simple words. The older woman continued the story. "They burned what they tore down. Said they were clearing the land for construction. When we tried to fight back, they brought in the sheriff. He told us we were trespassing on private property. Said if we didn't leave, we'd be arrested." "So you left," Reed said. "We ran," the older woman corrected. "In the night, with what we could carry. We split up, thought it would be safer. My daughter and I, we headed north, but they've been looking for us. The railroad wants to make sure we don't talk to anyone who might listen, wants to make sure the story stays quiet until the construction starts, and there's nothing left to argue about." Reed folded the map carefully and handed it back. His hands had stopped shaking, but his chest felt tight, like the barn had gotten smaller and the air thinner. He thought about Sarah, about the years they'd spent on this land, about the security of knowing it was theirs and always would be. He'd taken that for granted. Had assumed it was the natural order of things that a person could build a life somewhere and expect it to hold. These women had believed that too, and they'd been wrong. "I'm Anna," the older woman said, tucking the map back into her satchel. "This is my daughter, Grace." Reed nodded. Names made it harder, made them real in a way that strangers in his barn could be pushed aside and forgotten. "Reed Mallory." "We'll be gone in the morning, Mr. Mallory," Anna said. "We're grateful for the shelter." We didn't mean to cause you trouble. Reed looked at them, at their inadequate blankets and worn clothes, at Grace's wrapped hands and the exhaustion that sat heavy on both their faces. He thought about what would happen if he sent them out into the snow, thought about what would happen if anyone found out he'd sheltered them. The railroad had eyes everywhere, and the sheriff was already in their pocket, helping fugitives, because that's what these women were now. Fugitives from a crime of existing in the wrong place could bring trouble Reed didn't need. But he also thought about Sarah's locket on the mantel, about the man she'd married versus the man he'd become, about the distance between what was safe and what was right. "You'll freeze out there," Reed said finally. "Storm's going to get worse before it gets better." "We don't have a choice," Grace whispered. Reed stood there in the dimness of the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and old wood, and felt the weight of 3 years of grief pressing down on him. He'd been going through the motions for so long, following routines that kept him from thinking, from feeling, from deciding anything that mattered. But this mattered. These women, cold and frightened and depending on what he chose to do next, they mattered. "Come to the house," Reed said. Both women looked at him with identical expressions of wary disbelief. "I've got food. Heat. You can clean up. Get warm." Reed heard his own voice as if from a distance, surprised by the words even as he spoke them. "One night. Give you a chance to figure out your next move." "Mr. Mallory," Anna began, but Reed shook his head. "My wife died 3 years ago, been living alone since then. Nobody's going to notice 2 extra people in my house for a night. And anyone who does, well, I'll handle that when it comes." He turned toward the barn door before they could argue, before he could change his mind. "Get your things. Follow me to the house. And stay close, the wind's picking up, and I'd rather not lose you in the dark." Behind him he heard the rustle of movement, the soft murmur of voices conferring. Then footsteps, hesitant at first, then steadier. Reed pushed open the barn door and stepped out into the snow and the wind and the gathering night, and for the first time in 3 years he felt like he was walking towards something instead of just away. The house felt different with other people in it. Reed noticed it the moment they crossed the threshold, the way the air shifted, the way his own breathing sounded too loud in the sudden warmth. Anna and Grace stood just inside the door, snow melting off their inadequate clothes and pooling on the worn floorboards Sarah had insisted on refinishing 20 years ago. "Bathrooms down the hall," Reed said, pointing. "There are towels in the closet. Clean ones. You can wash up, warm yourselves." Neither woman moved immediately. They stood there, taking in the house, the furniture that had been in the same places for decades, the photographs on the walls, the silver locket on the mantel that caught the firelight and threw it back in small, bright pieces. Reed saw his home through their eyes and felt a sudden shame at how much he had that they didn't, how much he'd taken for granted. "Go on," he said more gently. "I'll make something to eat." Anna nodded and touched Grace's arm. The younger woman followed her mother down the hallway, moving carefully, as if afraid the floor might give way beneath her. Reed heard the bathroom door close, heard the water start running, and stood alone in his living room, wondering what he'd just done. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him safe and functioning for 3 years, listed all the reasons this was foolish. These women were strangers. They were fugitives. They brought trouble with them like a shadow. If anyone found out he was harboring them, if the railroad men came asking questions, if the sheriff decided to involve himself, Reed had no illusions about how that would end. He'd be lucky if they just threatened him. More likely, they'd find ways to make his life difficult, push him to sell, make him regret the choice. But a deeper part of him, the part that had been buried under grief and routine, felt something else. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple relief of making a choice that mattered, regardless of the consequences. Reed moved to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He had the basics: eggs, cheese, some leftover chicken from earlier in the week. Nothing fancy, but enough to make a meal. He set to work, his hands falling into familiar motions. Sarah had taught him to cook during those first years of marriage when they couldn't afford to eat out, and she'd insisted a man should know his way around a kitchen. He'd grumbled about it then, but after she got sick, those skills had meant the difference between eating and not bothering. The bathroom door opened. Grace appeared first, her face scrubbed clean and her dark hair combed back and still damp. She'd removed the cloth wrappings from her hands, and Reed could see the damage more clearly now, blisters and raw patches where the cold had gotten in. She caught him looking and tucked her hands into the folds of her shirt. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the water, for this." Reed nodded and turned back to the stove. "Scrambled eggs, all right. Not much, but it's hot. It's more than we've had in days." Anna emerged a moment later, and Reed was struck by how much younger she looked, without the layers of cold and exhaustion weighing her down. She couldn't have been more than 60, maybe younger. Her face was lined but strong, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You have a good home, Mr. Mallory," she said. "It's Reed, and it's not much. Just a place." "No," Anna said firmly. "A place is just walls and a roof. A home is something more. I can see it in how everything sits, how it's cared for, or was cared for. Once." Reed felt the words like a physical thing, a gentle probe into territory he wasn't ready to discuss. He dished out the eggs onto 3 plates, added some bread he'd bought in town last week, poured water into glasses. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Reed had eaten alone for 3 years, and the sound of other people's forks against plates felt both familiar and foreign. Grace ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear if she rushed. Anna ate with more ease, but Reed noticed how she watched him, measuring him with those sharp eyes, judging whether he could be trusted, or maybe just how long that trust would last. "You said you're heading to the Blackfeet territory," Reed said between bites. "You have people there?" "My sister," Anna replied. "She married a man from up there 30 years ago. They have land, a good house. She's written saying we'd be welcome. That's a long walk in winter. We'll manage." Reed set down his fork. "You have money? Supplies?" Anna's silence was answer enough. Grace looked down at her plate, and Reed saw her jaw tighten. "We had some money," Grace said finally, "but we lost it, or it was taken. There were men on the road 2 days back. They didn't hurt us, but they took our bags." Reed felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Did they follow you?" "No," Anna said quickly. "We hid, waited until they were gone, then came a different way. That's how we ended up here. We were trying to stay off the main roads." "Those men, were they railroad men?" Anna shook her head. "Just thieves. Wrong place, wrong time. But it doesn't matter now. We have what we're carrying, and nothing else." Reed pushed back from the table and moved to the kitchen drawer, where Sarah had always kept emergency cash. There was maybe $50 there, wadded up in a coffee can. He took out 20 and returned to the table, setting the bills beside Anna's plate. "I can't take this," Anna said immediately. "You can't walk 100 miles with nothing," Reed countered. "Buy food when you find it. Maybe a bus ticket for part of the way. Mr. Mallory Reed, you've already done more than you needed to. Then consider it payment for helping in the barn tomorrow," Reed said. "Those horses need their stalls mucked out, and my back's not what it used to be." It was a thin excuse, and everyone at the table knew it. But Anna looked at the money, then at Grace, then back at Reed. Slowly she reached out and took the bills, folding them carefully and tucking them into her pocket. "One day," she said. "We'll help with the barn tomorrow, then be on our way before anyone knows we were here." Reed nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of sending them back out into the cold. One day wouldn't be enough to get Grace's hands properly healed, wouldn't be enough to get them ready for the journey ahead. But he also understood the risk they were taking just by being here, and the risk he was taking by sheltering them. They finished the meal in silence. Reed showed them to the guest bedroom, Sarah's sewing room, really, with a day bed that hadn't been used in years. He brought them blankets and pillows, made sure they had everything they needed. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer, Reed said from the doorway. I won't bother you. We trust you, Anna said simply, and Reed didn't know how to respond to that. He left them and returned to the living room, to his chair by the fire that had grown low. He should have felt worried, should have been running through all the ways this could go wrong. But instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt useful. He felt like maybe the world still had a place for him that wasn't just waiting around to die. Outside, the wind picked up, the snow fell harder. Reed sat in his chair and listened to the old house creak and settle around him, and for the first time since Sarah died, he didn't feel completely alone. Reed woke before dawn to the sound of voices. For a confused moment, he thought Sarah was talking to someone in the kitchen, that the last 3 years had been a dream, and he'd wake to find her making coffee and humming to herself. Then memory caught up with consciousness, and he remembered the women sleeping in the guest room. He dressed quickly and followed the sounds. Anna was at the stove, moving with the confidence of someone who knew her way around a kitchen, even if it wasn't her own. Grace sat at the table, her damaged hands wrapped in fresh cloth Reed recognized as coming from Sarah's sewing basket. You're up early, Reed said. Anna glanced over her shoulder. Old habits. On the land, you wake with the sun, or the work doesn't get done. I was going to make breakfast. You've done enough. Let us contribute what we can. Anna cracked eggs into a pan with practiced efficiency. We found coffee. Hope you don't mind. Reed minded, but not for the reasons he expected. He minded because it felt good, having someone else moving through his kitchen, filling the space with purpose. He minded because it reminded him how empty the house had become. Grace, Reed said, nodding to the younger woman. How are your hands? Better, she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. Anna, found some salve in your bathroom. We used a little. Hope that's all right. Use what you need. Reed poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. Storms passed. Roads will be clearer today. The unspoken implication hung in the air. They could leave, should leave, before anyone noticed. Anna served the eggs without comment. They ate together again, and Reed found himself watching them more carefully in the morning light, the way Anna moved with quiet authority, the way Grace's eyes never fully settled on anything, always scanning, always watching the windows, as if expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. You said you'd help in the barn, Reed said when the passed. Plates were empty. I'll hold you to that. But Grace, your hands, I can work. Grace interrupted. I've worked through worse. The statement was matter of fact, without self-pity, but it made Reed's chest tighten. He didn't ask what worse meant. He didn't want to know what it would take to make working with blistered hands seem like nothing. They bundled into coats. Reed lent them 2 of Sarah's old winter coats from the closet, thick wool things she'd kept for the coldest days. The women took them without comment, but Reed saw Grace's fingers linger on the fabric, stroking it as if she'd forgotten what it felt like to wear something warm and whole. The morning was crystalline and cold. The storm had left the ranch buried under a foot of fresh snow, everything clean and white and silent. Reed led them to the barn, acutely aware of how exposed they were out in the open. Anyone passing on the county road could see them. Tom might decide to stop by. The world that had seemed so empty yesterday suddenly felt full of eyes. Inside the barn, Reed set them to tasks that suited their conditions. Anna proved capable with a pitchfork, mucking out stalls with steady efficiency. Grace, despite her hands, insisted on helping with the horses, speaking to them in a low voice that gentled them immediately. Reed found himself watching her work, noticing how the animals responded to her presence, how she seemed to understand them without words. "You're good with them," Reed said, pausing beside her. Grace stroked the mare's neck. "We had horses. Before. My husband bred them, said they were smarter than most people if you took the time to listen." "What was his name?" "Daniel," she said it quietly, as if the name itself might shatter something. "We were married 8 years. He taught me everything I know about horses." Reed didn't ask what happened to Daniel. He already knew enough to guess. Instead, he said. "These two are getting old. They don't do much anymore but stand around and eat my feed. But they're good company." "Everything deserves to grow old," Grace said. "That's what Daniel used to say. Everything deserves its full time on earth." They worked in silence after that. Reed found himself grateful for the company, for the sound of other people breathing and moving in the space. The barn felt less empty. The work felt less pointless. They were nearly finished when Reed heard the truck. His whole body went rigid. He moved to the barn door and peered out carefully. Tom Hendricks's battered pickup was turning into the drive, moving slow through the snow. "Get back," Reed said sharply. "Both of you. Stay out of sight." Anna and Grace moved deeper into the barn without question, disappearing into the shadows between the stalls. Reed stepped outside and closed the barn door behind him, walking toward Tom's truck with what he hoped looked like casual confidence. Tom climbed out of the cab, his weathered face creased with its usual slight frown. "Morning, Reed. Wanted to check on you after that storm." "I'm fine, just doing some work in the barn. You want help?" Tom moved toward the barn door, and Reed's heart kicked against his ribs. "No need," Reed said quickly, stepping into Tom's path. "Just about done. You want coffee?" Tom studied him for a long moment. Reed could see the questions forming, the observations being made. Tom knew this ranch, almost as well as Reed did. Knew Reed's patterns, his routines. Knew something was off. "Coffee sounds good," Tom said finally. Reed led him to the house, acutely aware of the tracks in the snow, 3 sets of footprints instead of 1. If Tom noticed, he didn't mention it. They sat at the kitchen table, and Reed poured coffee with hands that wanted to shake. "You've been cleaning," Tom observed, looking around. "Place looks better." "Felt like it was time." Tom nodded slowly. "Railroad's been asking around, looking for some native women who ran off from one of the evictions. Said they might be dangerous, might be spreading lies about how things went down." Reed's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "That's so? That's what they're saying. Offered a reward for information. $500. Tom met Reed's eyes over his coffee. "That's a lot of money for just finding a couple of women who ran off." "It is," Reed agreed carefully. "Makes a man wonder what they're really afraid of," Tom continued. "What story those women might tell if anyone bothered to listen." The silence stretched out. Reed couldn't read Tom's expression, couldn't tell if this was a warning or just conversation. Finally, Tom set down his cup and stood. "Anyway, I wanted to make sure you were all right. Storm like that, man your age, living alone, just wanted to check. I appreciate it." Tom moved toward the door, then paused. "Reed, you need anything at all, you let me know. Sarah would have wanted me to look out for you." "I will." Reed watched Tom's truck pull away, watched until it disappeared down the road. Then he stood there in the cold, wondering if his neighbor had just offered help or issued a warning, and realizing he couldn't afford to guess wrong. Reed returned to the barn to find Anna and Grace still hidden in the shadows, their faces tight with fear that had become familiar. "He's gone," Reed said. "It's safe." Neither woman moved immediately. Grace's hands were shaking. Anna's jaw was set in a way that suggested she was holding back words that wanted to escape. "Who was he?" Anna asked finally. "Tom Hendricks, my neighbor." "A friend." Reed paused, choosing his next words carefully. He said the railroad's offering a reward. $500 for information about 2 native women who ran off from an eviction. Grace made a small sound in her throat. Anna's face remained impassive, but Reed saw her hand move to rest on her daughter's shoulder. "Did he see us?" Grace whispered. "No, but he's not stupid. He noticed things were different." Reed ran his hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the morning's tension. "Look, you can't stay here. Not if they're actively looking. Not with rewards being offered. Tom might not say anything, but someone else will. Someone always does when money's involved." "We'll leave," Anna said immediately. "We'll go now. We shouldn't have stayed the night. We've put you in danger." Reed wanted to agree. Wanted to send them on their way and return to his safe, empty life. But looking at them, at Grace's damaged hands and Anna's proud face that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion he found, He couldn't do it. "You'll freeze before you get 20 miles, Reed said. "And if they're watching the roads, you'll be caught before sunset." "Then what do you suggest?" Anna's voice held no challenge, just genuine question. Reed thought about it. About the ranch, about the back acres he never used anymore, about the old line shack up near the tree line that he hadn't visited in 2 years. It was barely standing, but it had walls and a roof, and was far enough from the house that no one would think to look there. "There's a place," Reed said slowly. "Up in the hills. Old shelter from when this ranch ran more cattle. It's rough, but it's out of sight. You could stay there until the search dies down." "How long do you think that will be?" Grace asked. Reed didn't have an answer. The railroad was patient when it came to protecting its interests. They could keep looking for weeks, months even. But he couldn't say that, couldn't take away the small hope he saw flickering in Grace's eyes. Hard to say. But it's better than walking into a trap on the county road. Anna considered this, her sharp eyes studying Reed's face. "Why are you helping us? You don't know us." "You owe us nothing." Reed thought about Sarah's locket on the mantel, about Marcus in Denver, wearing expensive suits and making careful phone calls once a month, about 3 years of going through motions and calling it life. "My wife used to say that decency wasn't something you practiced when it was convenient," Reed said. "It was something you practiced especially when it wasn't. She'd be ashamed of me if I sent you out there with nowhere to go." "Your wife sounds like she was a good woman," Anna said quietly. "She was." Reed cleared his throat. "I'll get supplies together. Food, blankets, firewood. You rest today, let Grace's hands heal more. Tonight after dark, I'll take you up there." They spent the afternoon in careful preparation. Reed moved through his house, gathering things. Sarah would have gathered extra blankets, canned goods, matches, a small camping stove he'd kept in the basement. He felt her presence in the choices, heard her voice guiding him toward what would be needed versus what was merely nice to have. Grace found him in Sarah's old sewing room, standing in front of a photograph on the wall. It showed Sarah at 40, her hair just starting to grey, her smile wide and genuine. She'd been working in the garden that day, Reed remembered. Dirt under her nails and joy in her eyes. "She's beautiful," Grace said softly from the doorway. Reed nodded. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer. Took her fast in the end, which I suppose was a mercy." "I'm sorry. So am I." Reed turned from the photograph. "You mentioned your husband, Daniel." Grace's hand went to her pocket, and she drew out a small photograph, edges worn soft from handling. She held it out to Reed. A young man looked back from the image, his face serious but kind, his arm around Grace's shoulders. They were standing in front of a barn that looked sturdy and well-maintained, horses visible in the background. "That was taken the day we moved onto our land," Grace said. "We'd saved for 5 years to buy those horses. Daniel said they were our future. We were going to breed them, train them, build something that would last. He looks like a good man." He was. He believed in things, in hard work, in honesty, in standing up for what was right. Grace's voice cracked slightly. "When the railroad men came, he stood in front of our door. He told them they couldn't just take what we'd built. He had the deed in his hand, the papers all legal and proper. He showed them everything." She stopped. Reed waited, giving her space to continue or not. "They laughed at him," Grace said finally. "Laughed at his papers. Then they beat him. In front of me. In front of everyone. They beat him until he stopped moving, and then they told me I had 10 minutes to get whatever I could carry before they burned the house down." Reed felt something hot and dark move through his chest. "Is he—" "I don't know," Grace whispered. "They took him away. Said he'd attacked them, that he was being arrested for assault on railroad employees. I haven't heard anything since. Don't know if he's alive, if he's in jail, if he's—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Reed handed back the photograph carefully. "I'm sorry, that's not enough, but it's all I've got." "You're helping us," Grace said. "That's more than anyone else has done. Everyone else just looked away, pretended it wasn't happening. Or worse, said we deserved it for being difficult, for not taking the railroad's money when it was offered. Nobody deserves that. Try telling that to the sheriff, or the judge, or anyone else who's supposed to protect people. Grace tucked the photograph away. We're not people to them. We're just obstacles. Reed didn't have words for that. Didn't know how to argue against the evidence of her experience. Instead, he said, "You'll be safe in the line shack. I'll make sure of it." Grace met his eyes, and Reed saw in them something he recognized from his own mirror, the look of someone who'd been hurt badly enough that trust didn't come easy anymore. "Thank you," she said simply. That evening, after the sun had set and the temperature had dropped below freezing, Reed loaded supplies into his truck. Anna and Grace climbed in beside him, wrapped in Sarah's coats and carrying the few possessions they'd managed to keep. Reed drove slowly up the back trail, headlights off, navigating by memory and the pale light of a rising moon. The line shack appeared as a dark shape against darker trees. It wasn't much. One room, a potbelly stove, a sleeping loft that might or might not still be sound, but it was shelter, and it was hidden, and for now, that would have to be enough. Reed visited the line shack every other day, bringing supplies and news from town. The women had settled in as well as anyone could, in a one-room shelter that leaked wind through gaps in the boards. Anna had somehow made it feel less desolate. A blanket hung over the worst of the cracks, their few belongings arranged with care, even a small arrangement of pine branches on the makeshift table that served as decoration. "You didn't have to do all this," Reed said on his third visit, setting down a box of groceries. "Doing nothing makes the time harder," Anna replied. She was grinding something in a small stone mortar, herbs or roots Reed didn't recognize. "Besides, I'm used to making do with what's available." Grace was in the loft, and Reed could hear her moving around up there. Her hands were healing, the raw patches beginning to scab over. She came down the ladder carefully, and Reed noticed she moved with less pain than before. "How are you holding up?" Reed asked. "Better," Grace managed something close to a smile. "Your wife's coat is warm, and Anna's been teaching me things I should have learned years ago." "What kind of things?" Anna held up the mortar. "Plant medicine. How to find what you need even when you have nothing. My grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her. Knowledge that goes back further than any of us can trace." She poured the ground mixture into a small cloth pouch. "This is for your joints. I've seen you favoring your left knee. Rub this on before bed. It'll help with the stiffness." Reed took the pouch, surprised by the gesture. "You didn't have to. You're bringing us food and risking your safety," Anna interrupted. "Let me contribute what I can." They sat together at the small table, sharing coffee. Reed had brought in a thermos. The potbelly stove threw off decent heat, and for a moment Reed could almost forget they were hiding, that there were men looking for these women, that everything about this situation was precarious. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, turning her cup between her hands. "Why didn't you ever have more children? Just the one son?" Reed was quiet for a moment, surprised by the question's directness. "We tried. After Marcus, Sarah had 2 miscarriages. The second one nearly killed her. Doctor said she couldn't safely carry another child." He stared into his coffee. "We thought about adopting, but Marcus was a handful, and the ranch kept us busy. Time got away from us, I suppose." "You must miss them both," Anna said. "Your wife and your son. Sarah's gone. Marcus might as well be. He calls once a month out of obligation, not because he wants to talk to me." "That's a hard thing," Anna said. "A parent and child out of rhythm with each other." "It's my fault," Reed admitted. "After Sarah died, I shut down. Didn't want his help, didn't want his sympathy. Just wanted to be left alone. He took me at my word. Can't blame him for that." Grace looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "It's not too late to reach out, to tell him you were wrong." "Maybe," Reed said, though he didn't believe it. "Some distances became too great to cross." Anna stood and moved to the window, such as it was just a gap in the boards with a piece of oiled cloth tacked over it. She pulled the cloth aside slightly, looking out at the winter landscape. "We had a good community," she said quietly. 30 families. We helped each other, raised children together, buried our dead in the same ground. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. What happened to the others? Reed asked. The ones who took the railroad's money? Scattered, Anna said. Some went to reservations, some tried to find work in towns where nobody wanted them. A few tried to buy land somewhere else. But land that's actually for sale to people like us, that's harder to find than you'd think. And the 5 families who stayed? Anna's face went hard. Gone now. All of us. I heard the Johnsons made it to Canada. The Walks at Night family. I don't know. They had small children. I pray they found somewhere safe. She turned from the window. We're the last ones I know of who are still running. Reed thought about the reward money. $500 just for information. That suggested the railroad was very interested in making sure Anna and Grace didn't reach safety, didn't tell their story to anyone who might have the power or inclination to do something about it. Tell me about your land, Reed said. What it was like before. Anna's expression softened. She returned to the table and settled into her chair like someone preparing to share something precious. The valley was beautiful. Creek ran through it year-round, cold and clean, good grazing, trees on the hillsides. My grandmother planted an orchard when she first claimed the land, apple trees mostly. They took years to establish, but eventually they thrived. Every fall, we'd harvest together. Everyone in the community. Make cider, dry apples for winter, share the crop. I remember sitting under those trees as a child, Grace added. My grandmother would tell stories about how we'd been pushed off better land before, how each generation had to start over somewhere new. But she always said this land, the land from the treaty, this was ours to keep, the government promised. Governments break promises, Reed said quietly. So we learned. Anna pulled out the old map again, unfolding it on the table. In the dim light of the line shack, the faded ink seemed to glow. Every family had their parcel marked. Every child knew which boundaries were theirs. We had schools, a church. We were building something that would last. Reed studied the map, seeing in its careful notations the evidence of lives planned and lived. He thought about his own ranch, about the generations of Mallorys who'd worked this land before him, about the assumption that it would always be his. That assumption was a privilege. He'd never understood that until now. I'm sorry, Reed said, for what happened, for what's still happening. Sorry doesn't change anything, Anna said, but her voice wasn't harsh. But witness does, remembering does. You're one of the first people who's bothered to listen to the whole story. Most people don't want to know. It's easier to believe we're just troublemakers, that we deserved what we got. Reed helped them check the stove, made sure they had enough firewood to last until his next visit. As he prepared to leave, Grace touched his arm. Thank you, she said. Not just for the supplies, for treating us like we matter. You do matter, Reed said firmly. He drove back down the trail in darkness, his headlights off, until he reached the main ranch. The house waited, warm and quiet. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a place he was actively choosing to return to, and that made all the difference. Reed found the letter in his mailbox on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a feed store circular and a notice about property taxes. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap, and the return address made his breath catch. Montana State Penitentiary, Deer Lodge. The letter wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Grace Running Bear, care of General Delivery, Billings, Montana. Someone had crossed that out and written Reed's address. In different handwriting, Tom Hendricks' handwriting. Reed realized, with a jolt. Reed stood at the mailbox, the winter wind cutting through his coat, and turned the envelope over in his hands. He should take it to Grace, unopened. That was the right thing, the decent thing. But something about the letter's journey from the state prison to Tom to Reed's mailbox suggested this was more than just a simple correspondence. This was information someone thought needed to reach Grace badly enough to break multiple rules to make it happen. Reed opened the letter. The handwriting was careful, almost mechanical, as if the writer had taken great pains to make every word legible. It began without preamble. Grace, if you're reading this, it means someone helped get this to you. I don't know who. I don't care. I just need you to know I'm alive. They brought me here 6 weeks ago on charges of assaulting railroad employees. The trial lasted half a day. I wasn't allowed to present evidence. My lawyer, a public defender who couldn't have been more than 25, advised me to plead guilty for a reduced sentence. I refused. They gave me 15 years, but that's not why I'm writing. Grace, there are 23 men in here on the same charges. 23, all from native communities along the railroad's northern route. All arrested on the same accusation, assaulting railroad personnel during eviction proceedings. All given sentences between 10 and 20 years. It's a pattern, a strategy. They're not just taking our land, they're removing anyone who might fight back, anyone who might organize resistance. They're eliminating witnesses. I've been talking to the other men. Every one of them says the same thing. They were defending their homes, their families. None of them threw the first punch, but all of them are here, and all of the railroad men walked free. There's more. One of the men here, James Crow, he used to work for the railroad before they evicted, and his family. He says the company is planning to expand the route through at least 10 more native communities in the next 2 years. He says they have a quota, clear the land by any means necessary, and anyone who objects gets the same treatment we got. Grace, if you're reading this, it means you got away. Stay away. Don't try to fight this. Don't try to come for me. These people have no limits to what they'll do. But if you can, if there's any way, tell someone who'll listen. Because if we don't stop this, there won't be any of us left. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. Daniel Reed read the letter 3 times, each reading making the weight in his chest heavier. 23 men, a pattern, a strategy. This wasn't just about taking land. This was systematic elimination of an entire people's ability to resist. He thought about Anna's map, about the careful notations of families and boundaries, about Grace's photograph of Daniel standing proud in front of their barn, about how easily all of it had been erased and how few people had cared enough to notice. Reed folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He drove to Tom's ranch without calling ahead, needing answers, needing to understand how this letter had made its way from a state prison to his mailbox. Tom was in his barn, working on a tractor that had seen better decades. He looked up when Reed entered, his expression unreadable. "You got it," Tom said. "Not a question." "How?" Reed asked. Tom set down his wrench and straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that only smeared the grease around. "I've got a cousin who works at Deer Lodge. He's seen what's been happening, the native men coming in on trumped-up charges, getting sentences that don't match the crimes. He started asking questions. Found out one of them was Daniel Running Bear. Found out his wife had fled north and might be in the area. So you knew," Reed said. "When you came by last week, when you mentioned the reward, you knew they were at my place." "I guessed," Tom corrected. "The tracks in the snow. The way you were acting. I've known you 30 years, Reed. I know when you're hiding something." He paused. "I also know you're not the kind of man who'd turn in 2 frightened women for reward money." Reed leaned against a workbench, feeling the world reshape itself around this new information. "Why did you help? Why not just tell the sheriff and collect the $500 yourself?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Reed had never heard from him before. "My mother was Cherokee. Did you know that?" Reed shook his head. "She passed for white her whole life. Had to marry my father, to own property, to be treated like a human being. She died never having told anyone but me and my sister what she really was. She was ashamed of it. Ashamed of having to hide. And I never did a damn thing to make it right." Tom looked at Reed directly. "I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left standing by while this happens again. Not when I can do something about it." Reed pulled out Daniel's letter. "Have you read this?" "No. My cousin said it was for the wife, said it was important." Reed handed it to him. Tom read it slowly, his weathered face going hard as carved wood. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back. 23 men, Tom said quietly. 23 that we know about. How many more? The letter says they're planning to clear 10 more communities in the next 2 years, and everyone's just looking the other way. Sheriff, judge, probably half the businessmen in town who see the railroad as economic development. Tom spat into the dirt. We have to do something. Like what? Go to the authorities? They're already bought. Then we go over their heads, state officials, federal if we have to. We get this story out where people can't ignore it. Reed thought about Anna and Grace, hiding in a line shack because coming out meant death or prison. Thought about Daniel and 22 other men locked away for the crime of defending their homes. Thought about 10 more communities waiting in the railroad's path. They'll fight us, Reed said. The railroad. They have money, lawyers, influence. They do, Tom agreed. But we have something they don't. What's that? The truth. And 2 women willing to tell it. Reed drove back to his ranch, with the letter burning a hole in his pocket. He waited until dark, then made the trip up to the line shack. Anna and Grace were settling in for the evening, and they looked up in surprise when Reed entered. He wasn't due for another visit until the next day. What's wrong? Anna asked immediately, reading his expression. Reed pulled out the letter. This came today. It's from Daniel. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. She reached for the letter with trembling fingers, sank onto a chair, and read it by the light of the kerosene lamp. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't make a sound. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her chest and bent forward, her whole body shaking. Anna read over her shoulder, one hand resting on Grace's back. When she looked up at Reed, her eyes were bright with fury, and something else, hope, maybe, or just the recognition that they weren't fighting alone anymore. He's alive, Grace whispered. He's alive. And he gave us a weapon, Anna added. She took the letter from Grace's hands and read it again, her finger tracing the words about patterns and strategies and quotas. This is evidence, proof that what happened to us is happening everywhere. Tom thinks we should go to the state authorities, Reed said. Get your story out where the local sheriff and judge can't bury it. They'll never believe us, Grace said, her voice still thick with tears. They'll say we're lying. They'll say Daniel's just a convicted criminal with an axe to grind. Maybe, Reed acknowledged, but maybe they won't. And either way, we have to try, because if we don't, this keeps happening. To your family, to 10 more families, to everyone in the railroad's path who doesn't have the resources to fight back. Anna stood, drawing herself up to her full height. In the dim light of the line shack, she looked like something ancient and immovable, something that had survived worse than railroads and corrupt sheriffs. Then we fight, she said simply. We go to Helena, we tell our story, we show them the evidence, and we make them listen. Reed nodded, though fear moved through him like ice water. They were about to declare war on one of the most powerful corporations in the territory. They had no weapons except truth, and truth hadn't been enough to save Anna's community or keep Daniel out of prison. But it was all they had. So it would have to be enough. The plan took shape over 3 days of careful discussion. Tom brought maps of Helena, information about which state officials might be sympathetic, and the name of a lawyer who'd built a reputation fighting corporations. Reed contributed his truck, his willingness to drive them the 150 miles to the capital, and a growing sense that everything in his life had been leading to this moment. Anna and Grace contributed their testimony, their truth. But knowing what needed to be done, and actually doing it, were separated by a gulf of fear and doubt that kept Reed awake at night. He sat in his chair by the fire, Sarah's locket catching the light, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. They could be arrested before they reached Helena. The lawyer might refuse to take the case. The officials might listen politely and do nothing. Worst of all, the railroad might decide that loose ends needed to be tied up permanently. On the second night of planning, Reed found himself dialing Marcus's number. The phone rang 4 times before his son answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Dad, it's 2 in the morning. What's wrong?" Reed almost hung up, almost retreated back into the careful distance they'd maintained for 3 years. But Daniel's letter was on the table in front of him, and Anna's map, and he found he couldn't keep hiding from the things that mattered. "I need to tell you something," Reed said, "and I need you to listen without interrupting." There was a pause. Then, "Okay." Reed told him everything, about finding the women in the barn, about the eviction and Daniel's imprisonment, about the letter and the 23 men and the railroad's systematic elimination of entire communities, about the plan to go to Helena and the very real possibility that it might end with Reed in a cell next to Daniel, or worse. When he finished, Marcus was quiet for so long. Reed thought the connection had dropped. "Dad," Marcus said finally, "you could lose everything. The ranch, your freedom, they could destroy you." "No, then why are you doing this?" Reed looked at the locket, at Sarah's face frozen in silver. "Because your mother would never forgive me if I didn't. And because I'm tired of being the kind of man who looks away when it matters." Another long pause. "Then, what do you need from me?" The question caught Reed off guard. "What? You called me for a reason. What do you need?" Reed felt something in his chest loosen. "If something happens to me, if I end up arrested or worse, I need you to make sure someone knows. I need you to be my insurance policy." "I can do better than that," Marcus said. "I can come out there. Be there when you go to Helena. Witness what happens. Hell, I've got connections with a few journalists in Denver. Let me make some calls." "Marcus, you don't have to. Dad, I've been waiting 3 years for you to let me help. I'm not about to miss the chance now." Reed closed his eyes, feeling tears he didn't know he had left. "Your mother would be proud of you." "I hope so," Marcus said quietly. "I'll be there in 2 days. Don't leave without me." The next day, Reed went to town for supplies. He needed food for the journey, spare gasoline, and a few items that would make the line shack more comfortable while they waited for Marcus to arrive. He kept his head down at the general store, paid in cash, avoided conversation. He was loading bags into his truck when Sheriff Morrison pulled up beside him. The sheriff was in his late 50s, 20 pounds overweight, with eyes that had seen too much and cared about too little. "Morning, Reed," the sheriff said, climbing out of his patrol car. "Haven't seen you in town much lately. Been busy at the ranch, I'm sure." Morrison leaned against Reed's truck, casual but deliberate. "You hear about the reward? Railroad's offering $500 for information about those native women who ran off." Reed kept loading bags, his movements steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Heard something about it. Thought you might have. You being out there alone with all that empty land makes me wonder if you might have seen something." Reed turned to face him directly. "If I'd seen something worth reporting, I'd have called you." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "The railroad's getting impatient. They've got investors breathing down their necks about the construction timeline. They're talking about bringing in private security, professional trackers." "That legal?" "Legal enough when you've got the kind of money they've got," Morrison straightened. "Point is, if you know something, now's the time to share it. Before this gets uglier than it needs to." Reed met his eyes without flinching. "I appreciate the advice, Sheriff." Morrison nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Your wife was a good woman, Reed. I was sorry to hear when she passed. Sarah always had a conscience that got her into trouble. I'd hate to see the same thing happen to you. I'll keep that in mind." Reed finished loading his truck and drove away, watching the sheriff in his rearview mirror until the man climbed back in his patrol car and headed in the opposite direction. Reed's hands were shaking on the wheel. Morrison knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to be watching. They were running out of time. That evening, Reed made the climb to the line shack with his supplies and his news. Anna and Grace listened as he recounted both conversations, Marcus's unexpected support and Morrison's thinly veiled warning. "We should leave sooner," Grace said. "If they're bringing in professional trackers, "We wait for Marcus," Anna interrupted firmly. "We need all the help we can get, and having someone with connections, someone who can get our story out even if we're arrested, that's worth the risk." Reed set down a battered compass he'd brought from his father's old things. The brass was tarnished, the glass face scratched, but it still worked. His father had carried it during the war, had brought it home, and kept it on his desk like a reminder that direction mattered, that finding your way was always possible, even when the path wasn't clear. "My father used to say that the compass doesn't choose your destination," Reed said, turning the object in his hands. "It just shows you where north is. The rest is up to you." "And which way is north for you?" Anna asked. Reed thought about it. About Sarah and the man he'd been when she was alive. About Marcus on the phone, eager to help after 3 years of careful distance. About Daniel in prison and the 23 men with him, and the 10 communities waiting in the railroad's path. "North is whatever direction takes me away from being the man I've been the last 3 years, Reed said. "North is doing something that matters, even if it costs me everything." Grace reached across the small table and covered his hand with her own, her healing skin rough against his. "You've already lost everything that mattered. We all have, at least this way. We lose it for a reason." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Anna wrote out her testimony in careful detail, every date and name and injustice documented on paper. Grace added her own account, including Daniel's beating and the burning of their home. Reed gathered evidence, the old map, Daniel's letter, even a few photographs he'd seen in Anna's satchel, showing the community before the railroad came. Tom visited the night before Marcus was due to arrive, bringing news that wasn't good. Railroads filed complaints with the state. They're claiming Anna and Grace are dangerous fugitives who threatened violence during the eviction. They're painting them as the aggressors. "It's a lie," Grace said quietly. "Of course it's a lie," Tom agreed, "but it's a lie with money and lawyers behind it, and that makes it dangerous." Reed looked at the assembled evidence on the table, paper and photographs, and testimony. It seemed so fragile, set against the machinery of power and money arrayed against them. But it was all they had. "Then we make sure our truth is louder than their lies," Reed said. Marcus arrived late the following afternoon, driving a rental car that looked out of place against the backdrop of snow and mountains. He was thinner than Reed remembered, his hair starting to grey at the temples, but his eyes held the same intensity that had marked him as a boy. Father and son stood in the ranch house, 3 years of distance between them that neither quite knew how to cross. Finally, Marcus stepped forward and pulled Reed into a hug that lasted longer than Reed expected. "I should have been here," Marcus said, "after Mom died. I should have stayed. You had your own life. Yeah, well, maybe it's time I remembered that your life matters too." They drove up to the line shack together, Marcus's expensive city shoes slipping on the snowy trail. Anna and Grace stood when they entered, their faces wary at the sight of a stranger. Reed made introductions, watched as his son shook their hands with genuine respect. "I made some calls," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "I've got a journalist from the Denver Post interested. She covers corporate corruption and native rights issues. She's willing to meet us in Helena, hear your story, run it regardless of what the state officials do." "That's risky for her," Anna said. "She knows. She's doing it anyway." Marcus looked at the evidence spread on the table, the careful documentation of systematic injustice. "This is important. People need to know what's happening." That night, they finalized the plan. They would leave at dawn, take back roads to avoid attention, arrive in Helena by evening. Marcus would arrange meetings with the journalist and the lawyer. Reed would provide transportation and support. Anna and Grace would provide the testimony that might finally make someone with power actually listen. Reed lay in his bed that night, unable to sleep. He thought about all the things that could go wrong, about Morrison and professional trackers and railroad money, about the possibility that they'd drive all the way to Helena just to be dismissed or arrested or worse. But he also thought about Sarah, about the woman who'd taught him that decency mattered, especially when it was hard. About Marcus, who'd driven through the night to help despite 3 years of estrangement. About Anna and Grace, who'd lost everything but somehow hadn't lost hope. Reed reached for the compass on his nightstand, felt its weight in his palm. The needle pointed north, steady and sure. The rest was up to him. He was ready. They reached Helena as the sun was setting, painting the Capitol building in shades of gold and amber. Reed had never been to the state capitol before. The building felt enormous and intimidating, all marble columns and brass fixtures, and the weight of governance pressing down from every stone. Marcus had arranged meetings for the following morning, but the journalist, Catherine Chen, wanted to meet that evening. They gathered in a small hotel conference room that Marcus had rented, the five of them crowded around a table scattered with documents and cooling coffee. Catherine was younger than Reed expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened as Anna and Grace told their story, taking notes in a worn notebook that suggested she'd done this kind of work before. She didn't interrupt, didn't question, just let them talk until they'd said everything that needed saying. When they finished, she set down her pen and looked at them for a long moment. "I believe you," she said finally. "That's the first thing you need to know. I've been covering stories like this for 15 years. Different companies, different communities, but the same pattern. Take what you want, eliminate resistance, use the legal system as a weapon against the people it's supposed to protect. Can you help us?" Grace asked. "I can tell your story," Catherine said, "but you need to understand something. The railroad has already started their counter-narrative. They've filed official complaints painting you as violent agitators. They have statements from witnesses, railroad employees, of course saying you threatened workers, destroyed property, resisted legal eviction orders. All lies," Anna said firmly. "I know, but they're lies with official stamps and sworn affidavits. My article can present your side, but it's going to be your word against theirs. And they have a lot more resources to make their words stick." "What about Daniel's letter?" Reed asked. "The evidence of a pattern?" Catherine picked up the letter, reading it again. "This helps. 23 men on identical charges, that's suspicious enough to raise questions. But the railroad will argue these men are criminals who coordinated their stories. They'll say this letter is propaganda designed to generate sympathy." "Then what's the point?" Grace's voice cracked with frustration. "If they can just dismiss everything we say, why are we even here?" Catherine leaned forward, her expression intense. "Because sometimes getting the truth out there is its own victory. Not everyone believes corporate narratives. There are people, regular citizens, advocacy groups, even some politicians who are looking for evidence of exactly this kind of systematic abuse. Your testimony, combined with that letter, combined with documentation of similar evictions along the railroad route that creates a narrative too big to ignore, but they can still try," Anna said quietly. "Oh, they'll try, and they might succeed, but once it's in print, once it's public record, they can't make it disappear completely. And that matters." They talked until late, Catherine helping them organize their testimony, identifying the strongest points, the most damning evidence. She asked hard questions, not to challenge them, but to prepare them for what the railroad's lawyers would ask. By the time they finished, Reed felt wrung out and uncertain, but also strangely hopeful. The meeting with the state officials was scheduled for 10 the following morning. They arrived early, Reed in his one good suit that Sarah had bought him for her sister's wedding a decade ago, Marcus in his city clothes that fit the surroundings better than anyone else's. Anna and Grace wore their best clothes, which wasn't much, but they carried themselves with a dignity that needed no adornment. The official who met them was Robert Thornton, Deputy Attorney General, a man in his mid-50s with carefully neutral expressions and a demeanor that suggested he'd heard many stories and believed few. His office was spacious and decorated with photographs of him shaking hands with various politicians. Behind his desk, through tall windows, the Capitol grounds spread out in pristine order. "Please, sit," Thornton said, gesturing to chairs arranged in front of his desk. It was not lost on Reed that the seating put them below Thornton's eyeline, supplicants before authority. Marcus produced the documentation they'd prepared. Anna's testimony, Grace's account, Daniel's letter, the old map showing the original land grant. Thornton examined each piece with the careful attention of someone trained to find flaws in evidence. "This is quite a story," Thornton said finally. "It's not a story," Anna said, her voice steady. "It's what happened." "Of course, I misspoke." Thornton set down the papers. "You understand, we receive many complaints about corporate conduct. Not all of them have merit. And in cases involving land disputes, there are often multiple perspectives on what constitutes legal procedure." "This wasn't a legal procedure," Grace said. "They burned our homes while we were inside them. They beat my husband and threw him in prison on false charges. According to the records I've reviewed, your husband was arrested for assaulting railroad employees during an eviction that had proper legal authorization." "The authorization was fraudulent," Anna said. "Our land was granted by treaty. We have documentation." Thornton picked up the old map, studied it with an expression that suggested he'd already decided it didn't matter. "Treaties can be complicated. Their enforcement often depends on various factors. Depends on whether the people being robbed have the money to fight back," Marcus interrupted. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. "That's what you mean, isn't it?" Thornton's neutral expression slipped slightly. "Mr. Mallory, I understand you're here to support these women, but I'd appreciate if you let me finish." Reed watched this exchange and felt his hope begin to curdle into something colder. Thornton wasn't here to help. He was here to find reasons not to act. The railroad had already won this room before Anna and Grace ever walked into it. Reed stood up. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he couldn't sit there anymore, listening to careful words designed to do nothing. Anna's hand touched his arm, a gentle restraint, but he shook his head. "My wife died 3 years ago," Reed said, his voice filling the office. "Cancer. She fought it hard. But in the end, it took her anyway. You know what she said to me right before the end? She said decency was the only thing we got to take with us. Not money, not property, not comfort, just whether we'd been decent when it mattered." Thornton's expression remained professionally neutral. "Mr. Mallory, I understand you're emotional. I'm not finished." Reed pulled Daniel's letter from his pocket, held it up. "There are 23 men in the state penitentiary right now on false charges. 23. And you're sitting here telling us that maybe their evictions were legal, that maybe the paperwork was in order, that maybe these women are just confused about how they lost everything. The legal process is broken," Marcus said, standing beside his father. "And you know it. You've seen the pattern. You've heard stories like this before. You just don't want to do anything about it because it's easier to look away." Anna stood as well, and finally Grace. The 4 of them faced Thornton across his expensive desk, and Reed saw something flicker in the official's eyes. Discomfort, maybe, or just annoyance at having his morning disrupted. "I can refer this matter for investigation," Thornton said finally. "That's the best I can offer. The process will take time." "How much time?" Grace demanded. "How much time while my husband sits in prison? How much time while the railroad clears 10 more communities? How much time do you need to decide that what happened to us matters? I don't make policy, Mrs. Running Bear. I enforce the law as it exists." "Then the law needs to change," Anna said quietly. "And if you won't change it, then you're just as guilty as the men who burned our homes." The meeting ended badly. Thornton promised to review their materials, promised to refer the matter appropriately, promised everything except actual action. They left the Capitol building and stood on the marble steps in the cold Montana sunlight. 5 people who'd risked everything for a meeting that had accomplished nothing. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice rough. "I thought if we just got someone to listen." "He did listen," Catherine said. She'd been waiting outside the meeting, and now she held up her phone. "I recorded the whole thing through the door. Not admissible in court, but it'll make great context for the article." "The article won't matter if nothing changes," Grace said. "Change doesn't always come from the top down," Catherine replied. "Sometimes it comes from the bottom up, from people reading stories and getting angry enough to demand better." From pressure building until the people in offices like Thornton's have no choice but to act. The article ran 3 days later on the front page of the Denver Post. Catherine Chen's careful documentation, Anna and Grace's testimony, Daniel's letter, and a photograph of the four of them standing on the Capitol steps, it all came together into a narrative too powerful to dismiss. The railroad issued denials immediately, threatened lawsuits, produced their own witnesses and documentation. But Catherine had done her research thoroughly. She'd contacted historians who confirmed the validity of the 1889 treaty. She'd interviewed other families who'd been evicted. She'd even found a former railroad employee willing to go on record about the company's strategy of removing native communities through any means necessary. The story spread. Other newspapers picked it up. Advocacy groups started calling. A lawyer from a national civil rights organization reached out to Anna and Grace, offering to represent them pro bono, and, slowly, grudgingly, the mechanisms of justice that had been too expensive or too inconvenient before began to move. Reed watched it happen from his ranch, where they'd returned after the article was published. Anna and Grace stayed in the guest room, no longer hiding, while letters and phone calls and visitors arrived with increasing frequency. Marcus extended his stay, working from Reed's kitchen table, coordinating with lawyers and journalists and anyone else who wanted to help. Tom stopped by one afternoon, a newspaper in his hand. "You did it," he said simply. "You got people to pay attention." "We don't know if it'll be enough," Reed said. "It's more than there was before. That counts for something." The state announced an investigation into the evictions and the imprisonment of native men on assault charges. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. The railroad's expansion plans were put on hold pending review. And somewhere in the penitentiary at Deer Lodge, Daniel Running Bear received a letter from his wife saying she was safe, that people were listening, that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Reed sat in his chair by the fire that evening, the house full of voices and purpose for the first time in 3 years. He looked at Sarah's locket on the mantel and felt her presence, not as an absence anymore, but as a guidance. He'd found his way north. The compass had pointed true. And though the journey wasn't over, though there were still battles to fight and wrongs to right, Reed Mallory knew he'd finally become again the man his wife had believed he could be. The man who stood for something when it mattered. The man who chose decency even when it cost him everything. The man who'd looked at 2 frightened women in his barn and decided that their lives mattered more than his comfort, and in making that choice had somehow saved his own life as well. Spring came to Montana the way it always did, tentatively at first, with false starts and late snows, then suddenly with wildflowers and green grass and the promise of new things. Reed stood in his garden, the first garden he'd planted since Sarah died, and turned soil that smelled rich and alive. Grace worked beside him, her hands healed now, calloused from honest work, but no longer bearing the marks of cold and desperation. She planted seeds with the careful attention of someone who understood that growth took time, that you put things in the ground with faith that they'd come up when they were ready. "Daniel says he wants to try tomatoes," Grace said, reading from a letter she'd received that morning. "Says he's been dreaming about fresh tomatoes for 6 months straight." Reed smiled. Daniel Running Bear had been released from Deer Lodge 3 weeks ago, his conviction overturned along with 16 others. 7 more cases were still pending, but the state's investigation had uncovered enough evidence of systematic fraud in the arrests to cast doubt on all of them. It wasn't fast enough, justice never was, but it was happening. "Tell him he's welcome to plant a whole row," Reed said. "Garden's big enough for everyone." And it needed to be. The guest room had been expanded into a proper addition, sleeping quarters for Anna and Grace, and soon for Daniel, when he finished his work with the lawyers in Helena. Tom Hendricks had donated materials. Marcus had sent money, and Reed had done the labor himself, alongside other volunteers from town who'd read Catherine's article and decided they wanted to help rebuild what had been broken. The valley that had been taken from Anna's community was in litigation now. The railroad had fought the return of the land, but public pressure and the mounting evidence of fraud had forced them to negotiate. It would take years to fully resolve, but the families who'd been scattered were beginning to return, beginning to believe they might actually reclaim what had been stolen. Some couldn't return. Some had moved on to other lives, other places. Some had died in the years between displacement and justice. But enough remained, enough were willing to try again, that the valley would once more hold a community. Marcus's car pulled into the drive, and Reed looked up to see his son climbing out, no longer wearing suits but jeans and work boots, clothing that suggested he'd decided Denver could manage without him for a while longer. He'd taken a leave of absence from his firm, had been working with the civil rights lawyers to help coordinate the legal cases and the efforts to restore the displaced families. "Dad," Marcus called out, "there's someone here to see you." Reed set down his tools and walked toward the house, wiping dirt from his hands. A woman stood on the porch, late 50s, with Anna's eyes and Anna's bearing. She held a document in her hands, and Reed recognized the official seal of the Montana Territory. "Mr. Mallory," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Catherine, Black Elk, Anna's sister, the one in Blackfeet Territory," Reed said, shaking her hand. "That's right. I came down to thank you in person, for what you did for my sister and my niece." She held out the document. "And to show you this," Reed took the papers. They were land deeds, newly issued, restoring portions of the valley to the families who'd held them before. Anna's name was on one, Grace's name beside it. A new start, written in legal terms and official stamps. "They're coming home," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything, they're actually coming home." Reed felt his own throat tighten. "That's good." "That's right. Anna asked me to give you something." Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a small carved box, the wood worn smooth with age. This belonged to her grandmother, the woman who first claimed the land. "Anna wants you to have it." Reed opened the box. Inside was a single seed, larger than the ones he'd been planting, darker and uctuant, older. A note in Anna's careful handwriting read, "Apple seed. From the original orchard. Plant it in your garden. Let it take root. Some things survive everything." That evening, Reed planted the seed in the center of the garden, in a spot where it would have room to grow, to spread, to become something lasting. Marcus stood beside him, and together they covered it with rich earth and marked the spot with a small stone. "Think it'll take?" Marcus asked. "It will," Reed said. "It's survived worse than Montana winters." They walked back to the house as the sun set. Painting the mountains in colors that reminded Reed of the evening, he'd opened the barn door and found two frightened women that had changed everything. The house glowed with light and voices, Anna and Grace preparing dinner, Tom Hendricks arguing good-naturedly with Catherine about something Reed couldn't hear, the sound of life being lived fully and without apology. Reed paused at the door, looking back at his land, at the garden that would grow, at the mountains that had witnessed everything, at the valley in the distance where families would soon return to rebuild on ground that was finally, legally, theirs. He thought about Sarah, about the decency she'd insisted on even when it was hard, about the man he'd been 3 years ago, going through motions and calling it life, about the man he was now, not perfect, not heroic, just someone who'd made a choice when it mattered and had somehow found his way back to himself in the process. The compass in his pocket, his father's old compass that he carried now as a reminder, pointed north. But Reed had learned that north wasn't a destination. It was a direction, a choice you made every day about who you wanted to be and what you were willing to stand for. He'd chosen, he'd stood, and in doing so, had discovered that the hardest choices aren't about right and wrong. They're about whether we still have the courage to be decent when decency costs us everything. Reed Mallory walked into his house, into the warmth and noise and blessed chaos of a life that mattered again, and closed the door on 3 years of grief and isolation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The legal battles would continue. The work of rebuilding would take years. But tonight, there was dinner and laughter and the certain knowledge that he'd done something worth doing. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything.